Cheers, Michael. You kindly didn't acknowledge that the last report I wrote for TII, I told you blatantly, kind of broke my brain so much that I went and worked on a mine site for a couple of years afterwards. It was kind of my last and kind of engagement in that kind of governance side of work for quite a long time, and I went and worked kind of on the ground at an incredibly contested, environmentally controversial, socially controversial mine site, and it immediately changed every single thing that I could have thought for the previous decade. Um, uh, the I think kind of an interesting kind of starting point on this. In a kind of a very start of the year, I was boringly going through all of the bilateral agreements that the US government has signed around critical minerals, with, dozens of different countries around the world. Um, and what you very quickly realize that is that probably the State Department has been replaced by one person with a cut and paste function because they're all very, very similar. But what is striking about those agreements is almost every single one of them contains a clause advocating deregulation as a pathway to critical minerals. It's really striking and I feel like there's been very little commentary that around these bilateral agreements committing or committing kind of all these countries to attempt to deregulate their mining sectors with the idea that that's going to speed things up. And certainly my experience over the past kind of decade or so was actually I think the deregulation debates got it wrong, and in fact, and we'll kind of get into that quite a bit. So I'm going to go through kind of six key findings and then kind of half of the recommendations, and then trying to keep it to kind of 15, 20 minutes so we can actually have the conversation. Um, Before I dive in, I know we're not going around the table, but I really do want to acknowledge a couple of people in the room who really changed how my brain thought on this. And it's really great when you get to work on projects where you get to the end of them and you just kind of know this is not the place where I thought I was going to be. And it's not the place I thought I was going to be because of the quality of the research and the writing that I was able to engage with and the quality of the conversations that I was able to have. Um, so I really want to shout out Andy Reynolds, who I had not actually met prior to this project, but was recommended to me at Inspire Resources. Really, really kind of shook my brain in a very, very useful way. Many of you will be familiar with the research of Deanna, who's on the call, Deanna John, they're all of the people at the Centre for Social Responsibility of Mining at the University of Queensland. And every time I kind of dived into an issue, almost inevitably there was a Deanna and John paper at the end of it. And so for those of you who have not come across the work of the Sustainable Minerals Institute, University of Queensland in this space, I can only encourage you to do so. Dieter Zinbar, who was incredibly thoughtful about the role of regulation, and then the amazing feedback that I received from Layla, from Anna Borman, and from Michael. So I just wanted to get that up front because you're all on the call. And while I take responsibility for the findings and the recommendations, that none of that's your fault. I just wanted to acknowledge it's as I said, it's a rare and precious thing to end up on a project where you find your worldview change so fundamentally. Um, so the first couple of points findings were kind of macro findings, and I think that the first one was just kind of quite how subjective the term critical minerals is, and there's a kind of a joke that goes around mining conferences. If you've ever kind of been to the kind of the mining Darbas or the um, IMARCs and PDAC, where kind of every couple of years mining companies reinvent themselves as something that's not a mining company. And for a while they were all technology companies, and for a while they were all kind of finance companies. And then for a while they were all kind of renewable energy companies. And the most recent conferences I've been to is it's almost impossible to move for every single mining company in the world suddenly declaring that they're a critical minerals company. But to that point, and this has been made a point made well by many others. Um, Critical minerals means critical to many people in different ways, where it's kind of economically critical to particular countries. I think in the US context, it particularly had very strong links to the Department of War and to a sense of constraint of supply around kind of sophisticated defense technology. Um, and in particular, that criticality is heavily focused on geopolitical contest with China, and it kind of leads to this second point. Um, I'm before I spent 20 years thinking about mining, I kind of started my life kind of more in kind of on the geopolitics and policy side of things, and I'm amazed at how quickly and how unquestioned the world has slipped into the idea that this is a kind of a zero-sum game geopolitical contest, and that critical minerals are critical because the Chinese have them and we don't. And so the point which I can't make fast enough and often enough is that the single best thing that we could do to stop critical minerals from being critical is to return to a normal trading regime around the world. And some of you may well have teams and people working on trade policy. And at the moment, that may seem like an uphill battle, but we've only really slipped into this kind of hyper competition around minerals and this kind of very competitive, very aggressive perception that critical minerals are critical because someone might take them away from us rather than trade them with us. That feels like a very, very recent thing, even if the planning behind it is not recent. And we don't have to accept that as an argument. And yet, if I was to take the unscientific view of my LinkedIn feed, largely that view is seen as the default view of world politics at the moment. And I feel like we're not investigating that enough. Um, the um, third and fourth findings, Deanna's going to start nodding along to some of these. In fact, there's almost a Deanna recommendation here and an Andy recommendation here. First of all, it strikes me that there's a very large focus on what we would call greenfields mines. So where are these new mines going to come from? And yet the majority of existing demand and increases in demand are being met by existing mines. So expansion of production, kind of what you'd call kind of brownfields expansions or near mine expansions out there. And that comes with significant disadvantages and advantages. The disadvantages is, consent has either been given or has been bulldozed through in terms of the community. There will be long-standing, sometimes positive, sometimes very negative dynamics between communities and companies. The positive side is there are resources, there are revenue flows there that can be used to influence how things happen. But I think it's one of those things where I think we need to kind of shift that debate a little bit from we're not just focusing on where the new mines are going to be, but actually what's happening with these existing mines. And from a regulation point of view, that often happens behind the scenes because change applications, so modest expansions or changes to how mines function, often don't see the light of day in a regulatory process. I was a mining regulator for a couple of years, and I had a queue of 300 permit applications on my team's desk, and probably three-quarters of them were change applications, and the vast majority of them were largely unseen and unheard of by the wider public. So there's an awful lot of change and expansion happening at existing mine sites that people may not be aware of. Uh, I mean, case in point, I worked in 2024 largely on one very large mine, and that mine had gone through 16 change applications in 25 years. It was a radically different mine from the mine that had been originally improved, and yet the vast majority of those applications had been pretty much unscrutinized, and it led eventually to really significant community conflict. The second finding is around what are known as junior mining companies, but I think we shouldn't really even call them mining companies, but just the way they are funded, and I focus on this because they are the logical first step in developing these greenfields mines. The way they are structured, the way they are staffed, the way they are funded, um, is in such a way that it almost guarantees to ignore and or exacerbate political, social, cultural, and environmental impacts. And I'll talk through that a bit more. And and over the past, I don't know, decade or so, I feel like I've had this conversation with so many people, and it ends with inevitably someone in industry saying, "Oh, that's just how the market is. Like it's just how junior mining companies are." And I kind of got to the point in this research where it's like, well, actually, if these are the critical seeds of whether materials are available for energy transition or not, just saying, oh well, that's just how the market is. It's just always it always has been damaging. It's always going to continue to be damaging is not good enough. Um, and um, and I'll put up a slide shortly that kind of shows the differences between these kind of junior mining companies and kind of larger mining companies. But it's a real risk, and I kind of feel like most of certainly the mining world just kind of shrugs and kind of goes, oh, it's kind of how projects get started. And it's a real problem. Um, the fifth and sixth findings, and these are the last ones, are around, and this is almost where the project started. I was supposed to just do five and six, and then I ended up doing one, two, three, and four as well, which was thinking around the research around what makes or breaks acceptance or rejection of mining projects by communities. And I've been fortunate enough to, for the past kind of 4 or 5 years, work in a firm that um, had an awful lot of quantitative data around community sentiment and an awful lot of modeling of that data. And that data ends up very consistent, actually, with my own experience, both as a consultant as well as someone who's worked on the mine site as well as a regulator, which is actually the two big drivers of acceptance. And I say drivers, they could equally be barriers of acceptance, um, tend to be procedural fairness or what we'd call accountability. So that typically is structured as did a company proactively engage with the community? Did it listen to them? And did it then change what it was doing? Did it actually change what it was doing based on what it's heard rather than just, oh, well, I consulted. Thanks for telling me what you think, but I'm going to continue on with my project. And those accountability measures, that procedural fairness comes up again and again and again. I remember stacking up 37 different models of different mine and infrastructure sites around Australia, and that was always the top or the second to top kind of featured factor that determined or was either an enabler or a blocker of whether communities accepted or rejected um, projects. Um, the second most consistent one when you stack up that data is regulation. And this is quite striking, which is that actually communities want regulation. Communities will there'll be a significant impact on acceptance of any existing or new mines if regulation is seen to be weak or non-existent. And so it's quite an interesting situation in which all around the world we have governments pushing around what they either call expedited permitting or fast track or accelerated permitting regimes, which effectively seek to get rid of these two things. They seek to weaken regulation, and they seek, as part of that weakening of regulation, to reduce the voice of community in project decision making. And yet, the data that I've seen, and some of it's presented in the report, quite consistently says that those are two of the biggest factors that determine whether a community will accept or reject mining activity. And so, for quite a few years, I've been kind of boring people to death, turning up at conferences and saying, actually, fast track's going to end badly for people. And I think it's a process that is very good for deal making, but less so for actually long-term activity. Um, I'll quickly skip through this, but for those of you who have not worked in the sector a lot, I think it's really important to to understand this difference between the junior mining companies, the exploration companies, and the mining companies. And perhaps an easier metaphor is junior mining companies almost act like tech startups. They're kind of invisible. They're basically a massive bet on data and the market, which is most commonly the Toronto Stock Exchange, but also the Australian Stock Exchange, pretty much only rewards increases in geological data. They don't really care much. There's this quite humiliating bit that if you care about environmental and social risks and impacts, and then you go into any junior mining company and you go and look for environmental and social factors, it will be a footnote on page 16 out of a 17-page slide presentation. Just it's not there. They don't care. The market doesn't reward them or incentivize them. And these are companies, most of whom will fail, but a small number of which are aiming to be acquired by much larger firms who will then either take the project further and potentially turn it into a mine. So better to think of these as flash and burn tech startups that might operate for a couple of years, and some will become famous and most will not. But it leads to a very reckless approach to environmental and social impacts, as opposed to and how these differences, and if we go to the next slide, kind of leads to these incredibly uncomfortable moments of regulation, and we're going to kind of dive into this shortly, where you often hear very little from an exploration company, from a junior mining company during the early phases, and these early phases will often last years and years. They may tick through multiple junior mining companies as projects are passed from company to company to company. Whatever relationships or information is built up across time between those different companies, the only data that ever gets passed on is the geological data. Or, and what's striking here is that the very narrow geological focus of the company, whereas communities often have to live in great uncertainty for a very long period of time, and may actually have been able to say from day one, hey, actually, 94% of your exploration area is fine to me, but there's 6% that's never going to be okay. Or actually, these are the people who are critical to the relationship. And I have both inside a mining company as well as a regulator spent many frustrating days trying to get junior mining companies to connect with communities, and I have almost always failed, even though I think, trying to help them out quite often. Um, and then when it finally gets to this point where they've got a big enough resource that potentially could be turned into a mine, suddenly they emerge into the light. Suddenly, a community engagement manager gets hired, and consultation starts happening. You normally have this very superficial engagement process, a massive overstatement of economic benefits, and understatement of risks and impacts, and a continued real deficit in the capacity of the company to know how to actually engage, how to consult, how to consider environmental, social, and cultural impacts and risks. And the reason I really wanted to kind of talk through this, and we'll talk about it later, is it jams all of our regulatory considerations into one intense point. And one of the recommendations that we're going to discuss a bit further later on is the need to kind of insert some regulation before that permitting process as well as after that process, and somehow do that in a way that doesn't actually slow it down even further. We'll flick to the next slide, Michael. Sorry, yeah, he's driving it. Um, so um, I think having made a big deal about kind of trust being the key driver as to whether projects are accepted or rejected, it's useful to have a definition. This is one that goes back a while, but it's useful looking at that second paragraph of trust effectively being based around kind of an integrity-based kind of element of trust that people are operating according to a set of principles rather than an ever-changing set of kind of wants and desires or needs. And secondly, that is competency based, that people do what they say they're going to do, that they manage the particular issues they say that they're going to manage. It's an expectation that someone's not going to exploit a power differentiation or a vulnerability, which when it comes to mining companies and communities is almost always there and almost always very significant. Um, we'll keep going because I realize that I am going on a bit further. The report then dives into some of the research. Now, there are lots of different models around community acceptance, around trust acceptance, rejection, outrage, social impact, social risk. So this is one of many. It's a highly contested debate. That the reason why I've put this in partly because I've worked with the data. This is one such diagram that comes out of 20,000 survey responses over a decade in Australia. There's similar work that's being conducted in Canada and then far more difficult to find, but which I know exists, kind of site by site kind of projections of what are the key drivers of trust and acceptance or rejection in different communities. But again, these are the kind of the community level sentiment surveys that really back up that people are looking for those accountability mechanisms and looking for good regulation and as key drivers of acceptance or rejection. This particular model is a countrywide model, so it tends to be a bit more macro, having these bigger issues focused on acceptance and rejection. If you think about an individual mine site, often it's just those kind of four or five elements running down the side. And the numbers represent a kind of a relative weighting. So a point kind of 0.28 is kind of has twice the impact on trust than say a 0.14 does. Um, Key to focus on here, and it kind of we're going to come up in one of the recommendations, um, is again very consistently you see community benefits appear in these models, but very rarely at the top of the models. Very rarely do they come up as the top issue. And yet, when you look at what companies and governments are often talking about, they are almost always leading with the benefit statement. And they are almost leading with, here I am, this is my company, these are the benefits I'm going to give you, please approve. And yet, the data and the research, both quantitative and qualitative, suggests that that's actually a very, very weak approach and actually has the potential to lead to rejection or conflict where companies and governments continue on regardless. So on to recommendations, and as I said, we will get the full report to all of you, so you don't have to just have the short version. And we'll focus in on kind of 3, 4, and 6 around capacity building, around regulation, and around benefit sharing. And then next month, we're going to have another one of these workshops, which focuses in particularly on the company side, so on recommendations 3 and 6. So if we can go to the next slide. Um, the the first recommendation is, and thank you particularly to Layla and Anna for really stoking this part of my brain, which is um, when we think about work that is done in the sector, and I'm as guilty of this as many, there is very high levels of capacity building in inverted commas or programs that are almost exclusively focused around communities, around civil society, around government agencies at different levels, but not companies. And I guess my question is why? You know, they're doing the extracting, they're causing the impacts, they're either the 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 problem or the cure. And yet I'm struck by how little direct capacity building happens with companies. It seems to be influencing, lobbying, trying to change the laws and the rules by which they operate. And it kind of goes slightly to a kind of do you do you see mining companies as operating to a particular plan, or do they actually, in many cases, just really not know what they're doing? And I think actually, in a lot of cases, they just don't actually know what they're doing. They're not actually very good at this. And that's not to say that there aren't large multinationals who know that they are causing harm and are quite purposeful about it. It's just to say I'm struck by how little capacity building there is, given that they are the immediate cause of of negative impacts or positive impacts. Um, and so there's some questions in there, and so there's a recommendation in there around direct engagement with companies, and particularly the companies where those brownfields expansions are starting to happen, which is why that engagement with ICMM, I think, would be so critical. The next recommendation is around a new approach to regulation. Um, we'll go on to the next slide, which focuses on this adaptive governments partnership. The top set of dots kind of shows that process of exploration through to feasibility, approvals or permitting, then production and expansion. And I'm struck that the real heavy work of regulation is really done, and community engagement is really done in the middle of the process. And as I said, often exploration companies or junior companies will have been around for years and years in advance with often very little impact engagement with regulators. And that's often because actually, in the greater scheme of things, exploration programs don't create significant environmental impacts. They do create environmental impacts, but compared to kind of other major infrastructure, or certainly compared to mines, they don't. Um, and these companies may have 5 people on staff, none of whom is actually based in the area permanently, and none of whom have engagement skills or background. And then we suddenly get this very large set piece mining permit application, which tries to pull everybody in and deal with sometimes decades worth of grievance, misunderstanding, lack of engagement, lack of consideration around areas of cultural, social, and environmental sensitivity. And then similarly, the regulators and then the community engagement often then disappears again after that point. And so the report talks about more of a multi-stakeholder approach to governance, which actually could you potentially speed up critical minerals projects by making regulation happen earlier and in a much more multi-stakeholder approach rather than this kind of big regulator has a big set piece of regulation only at the point of mining. That if communities and regulators are involved much earlier on, it becomes a lot easier to identify risks that can be completely avoided or impacts that completely avoided. And similarly with those ongoing production. And I think that's kind of one of the sleeping giants of the critical mineral story at the moment is if the majority of production and expansion production is coming from brownfield sites, one of the greatest risks we're seeing is most of that will be going through pretty minor regulatory processes, it's often invisible to communities because the mine's already operating and they're saying, oh, well, we'll just add on the satellite resource. We'll just do a small pit here. We'll just do an underground expansion. And yet, when you knit together 10 of those expansions together, you've got a whole new mine. Very little public oversight, very little engagement of regulators around that, except around core elements of kind of the economic resource and around health and safety are often kind of the main considerations and treatment of tailings dams. So the report goes into a suggested approach of making that more of a more multi-stakeholder process and more of a continuous process. On to the final one, um, which is a non-recommendation, and this is the one I think which has already had a bit of pushback from a earlier presentation we did, which is I'm struck and I'm worried about the amount of airtime that benefit sharing is getting as a solution here. It seems to be the thing that all the conferences are talking, all the guidelines are talking about, all the companies want to engage in, and when governments faced with the idea that they need to speed up development, they start talking about different benefit sharing arrangements. And and I've got a couple of fundamental problems with that. My first problem with it is just from a basic what's the data around what communities care about. Actually, it's there. Sure, they care about benefits, but not to the expense of addressing environmental and social impacts, and certainly not to the expense of accountability and quality of regulation. And so, if you were to be slightly conspiratorial, I'd almost suggest that companies and governments want to talk about benefits because it doesn't require them to talk about something that makes them far more vulnerable and is far more difficult to talk about, which is actually, let's take a longer term view of social and environmental impacts. Let's take a different approach to regulation. Let's actually genuinely engage with communities. As I've kind of written in the final point down there, it requires no change in skill sets. It requires no change in activity beyond a change in the budget line. It doesn't require companies or governments to be particularly vulnerable or to engage in a different way. And so the recommendation in the report is perhaps we need to stop focusing so much on benefit sharing, recommendations, guidance, models, because I think it's distracting and I think it reduces communities down to being these kind of purely economic actors that, so long the price is right, then any project can get through. I'm going to leave it at that.